Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I'm Stuart Reynolds, and I'm the convener of the BRLSI's science group. It's under the aegis of the science group that tonight's speaker will be telling us all about Lord Kelvin. But actually, this talk has been specially convened as one in the bicentenary program for the BRLSI. Kelvin and the BRLSI were in fact born in the same year in 1824. So this is our 200th anniversary, and it's also Kelvin's. Before I introduce tonight's speaker to you, he's very familiar to many of you, I think, already. I should just say that tonight's a Friday night, and we don't do practice fire alarms on Friday nights. So if there's a fire bell goes, it's a real one. So what you should do is to go down the stairs, exit the building by the means that you came in here, and we'll all assemble somewhere in Queen's Square. I dare say we'll recognize each other out there. Should those stairs be on fire, don't worry, we can go out by the other door over there and down the other set of stairs at the other end of the building. Of course, that's not going to happen, but I thought I ought to tell you. The other thing that I should tell you is that we've got some talks coming up that you might like to know about. And in particular, I'd like to tell you about a talk on Thursday, November the 21st, called An Astronomical Adventure Story. It's by Professor Michael Burton. And I think that Tony could probably tell us what it's about.
Well, Michael Burton is director of the Observatory and Planetarium, and that exists because of the direct result of William Herschel, who discovered, of course, right here in this hearing bar. His side effects of his discovery were that the then Archbishop of Armagh decided to set up this observatory, and it's got connections with two observatories in the Republic of Ireland, which we're going to explore. Dunsink near Dublin, and Birr Castle, where the telescope known as the Leviathan of Parsons Town was built, and remained the largest telescope for about 70 years, the largest in the world, that is. So that's what the talk's going to be about.
Ah, terrific. It's about big Irish astronomy. Excellent. So that's on Thursday 21st, so make a note of that. And the other thing that I'd like to tell you about is a talk. Whoops, Peter's notes are about falling off. It's all right, Peter. Is on Thursday, November the 28th. And it's a discussion meeting, a public discussion meeting about COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. And you may be aware that there's a climate change mitigation international cooperation meeting going on there. And lots of people have great hopes and fears for that meeting. And by Thursday, November the 28th, we shall know what has happened. And we've planned to put on a meeting here with 4 expert witnesses about international cooperation for climate change. I won't tell you who they all are, but they're all very eminent, and there'll be a chair as well, and they will make some opening statements, and then it'll be a question and answer session, rather in the style of Radio 4's Any Questions, and it's going to be great, so please come along. Anyway, tonight we're very privileged to welcome a very old friend of BRLSI, Dr. Peter Ford, who was an academic in the Department of Physics at the University of Bath, and who was instrumental in getting BRLSI back on its feet quite a few years ago, and partly, I'm sure that many people in this room remember that you played a very big part in that, Peter. And Peter's going to remind us what a great person Lord Kelvin was. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Does this work? Oh, good. Well, thank you for all turning up. It's a splendid audience and a particularly sort of unpleasant cold night, so I appreciate it. Okay, now that is a picture of Lord Kelvin, and now I suppose that's him wishing you all the best. That is in fact dated. He was 28 at a time when this picture was taken. So since he was born in 1824, quick calculation will show you that that is 1852, which actually is a year after the Great Exhibition of 1851. Now, I've not read anything as to whether he actually attended it or not, but I can't help feeling that someone of his intellect would have. I mean, it attracted something like 10 million people, so I'm sure he did. So, to begin, when Stuart invited me to give this lecture on Lord Kelvin, I'd forgotten that this was the 200th anniversary of his birth. And the reason for this was it doesn't seem too long to me, since I attended an event at Glasgow University marking the centenary of his death. This was in October 2007, to be precise, and at the time I was still rather demob happy, having retired the previous May from the physics department of the University of Bath, as Stuart has mentioned. Now, in many ways, I feel this lecture would be much more meaningful if we could all take an easy jet flight to Glasgow and view the house in which he lived, as well as his lecture theatre, which still contains an experiment which has been ongoing for the last 150 years or so, and his laboratories and a museum devoted to a lot of his equipment. Now, when I got back in October 2007, I got back to Bath, I saw that I'd received an ominous-looking letter in a brown envelope marked "On Her Majesty's Service." Now, to my surprise and delight, it said that I'd been awarded an MBE for services to higher education and science. In fact, it didn't really mention that. It mentioned that my name had been put forward for consideration, and that I wouldn't know about it until I saw it appear in the London Gazette on the 29th of December, some 2.5 months later. Now, I don't know anybody who reads the London Gazette. In fact, I don't even think I've ever seen it. Anyway, that's the story. However, as and I'm sure many of you know, these lists appear in the Times, and the people who were living on the ground floor at the time, they took the Times, and so I thought I could check there. Now, I remember waking up earlier that day. I was very nervous about it, a bit like waiting for exam results. Now, as I say, someone in the building had the Times. I was able to confirm that my name was in fact there for an MBE. And then a few hours later, Rodney Tye. Now, many of you must remember Rodney Tye, do you? I mean, he was an interesting individual, and he lived to be 97. And I think he did have an obituary in the Times because he was an equerry to, I think, the Duke of Edinburgh. And he phoned me up to congratulate me. Now, rather than listen to me, the definitive book is this. And it's a huge book. It's by two people, Norton and Wise, and it runs to over 900 pages of tight script, very close script with footnotes and references. And apparently writing it was a massive effort. It took over 10 years. And that's something I can appreciate, since I took about 8 years writing a book about a third of that, some years after I retired. And inside this book, I saw, I came across this, which one or two of you might have come across, Southwestern Branch of Institute of Physics. I was so quite prominent in those days. Southwestern Branch of Institute of Physics, I think, no longer exists. But it's Thursday, the 25th of November, 1999. Now, that's almost exactly 25 years ago. And the venue is the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, 16 to 18 Queen Square, Bath. So the venue and the time are both the same. And it's by Dr. Crosby Smith, History of Science Unit, University of Kent. The title was Kelvin by Degrees, Understanding the Life and Work of William Thomson, Lord Kelvin. And I'll read it because it's quite an interesting abstract. William Thomson, then brackets Lord Kelvin, is today commemorated by the Kelvin scale of temperature which bears his name. Along with his colleagues, he also introduced the modern terminology of energy, which is potential and kinetic energy, and took a leading role in the laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cables. In his own time, he was the most celebrated of all Victorian physicists and became the first scientist to be elevated to the House of Lords. This lecture will show how the long life and prolific work of Kelvin can be understood in the context of a world of steam power and imperial ambition. So at this stage, I feel I could take a bow, and that could be the end of the lecture. But many of you might think you've been a bit short-changed, and so I will continue. Now, William Thomson was born on the 26th of June, 1824, at College Square in Belfast, and was the second among 7 children of one James Thomson, who really didn't live that long, 1786 to 1849, so he was 63 when he died. And he was a professor of mathematics in the Belfast Academical Institution. And his wife, Margaret Gardner, who lived even less time, 1790 to 1830. And if you read about these things, so many people had really relatively short lives, 40 years or so. I'm fortunate enough to have lived for double that time and hopefully still got some semblance of a brain. Now, after Margaret's death in 1830, this is Margaret Gardner, James Thomson assumed full responsibility for the education of his students. Now, if you go to Belfast, there's actually quite a nice statue of Kelvin in a park there. The only trouble is that, in a way, is it's a statue. There's invariably a pigeon standing on his head, which seems to be a feature of many statues. And unfortunately, his head is also covered in birdlime, which tends to sort of lower the image a bit. Anyway, 2 years after he was at Belfast, he took up an appointment at the Glasgow College. He became a chair of mathematics. Now, for many years, there's been close links between Belfast and Glasgow. If you travel up the Antrim coast between Belfast and the Giant's Causeway, which is a very beautiful journey, you can see the west coast of Scotland. The nearest point between Northern Ireland and Scotland is a distance of some 12 miles, and that is the Mulligan Tower. Now, the Mulligan Tower was made famous by the Paul McCartney song about it, and it was also made infamous when over 20 years ago, a helicopter carrying a large number of senior military personnel crashed on the point. It is believed due to faulty computer software. And this was a precursor to the recent Post Office Horizon scandal, when faulty computer was largely responsible for errors arising in his accounts. Now, William Thomson's elder brother James received very little formal education, but instead listened to their father's junior classes in Glasgow, where the brothers matriculated in 1834. Now, the next slide is, these are pictures of the college at Glasgow, and they have this tower. It all looks pretty primitive in those days and pretty run down. The building, even worse. Yes, this is the building in which the Glasgow Physics Department was, and that is what contains the lecture theatre and the museum, which I've almost already talked about. So, for 6 years after they arrived, William Thomson received very little formal education. Instead, listened to their father's lectures, where they learnt. And William matriculated, believe it or not, when he was just 10 years old. This is where they were, and this is a picture of his father, James Thomson, who really had quite an influence on both children, particularly because their mother had died. And so for several years when they were in Glasgow, William and his older brother James were more or less inseparable. Now, James became increasingly interested in engineering problems, while William was more interested in mathematics and natural philosophy. Now, they lived in Glasgow, which was a pretty horrible place in winter, and was extremely cold and damp. And they often used to travel up here to the Firth of Clyde, and this shows the foreshore near to a place called Largs, and later, as you see, the Kelvin country seat. And this was, you could look across, I think, there to the Isle of Arran, and this was Thomson's famous favourite summer retreat after the rigours of a Glasgow winter. And later in life, William Thomson became Baron Thomson of Largs. Now, in 1842, William Thomson entered St Peter's College in Cambridge. And St Peter's College is the oldest of Cambridge colleges, and was apparently founded in 1284 by the then Bishop of Ely. Is also among the poorest and the smallest of the colleges. Now, you might have heard about it in that until recently, the master or mistress, or whatever you call them, of the college was Bridget Kendall, who had been the BBC Russian correspondent, and as I say, she became head of the college. Now, at that time, and I think still, Cambridge was regarded as the best place in England to obtain a mathematical education. I'm sure Chris Budd won't disagree with me. You better not. Thomson embraced Cambridge life to the full. He would get up early in the morning, and his days would involve, now this sounds like a true student activity, walking, skating, swimming and reading, above all wide-ranging discussions with a large circle of friends, which often extended way into the night. Against his father's wishes, he became increasingly enthusiastic about rowing, which I'm sure took up an immense amount of time. And towards the end of 1843, he won a prestigious competition for single-seater sculling. He was also an enthusiastic musician, and he played the cornet. And he was a founder of a member of the Cambridge University Music Society in the spring of 1844. However, and this is a good thing, he did not neglect his mathematics. And in January 1845, he sat 12 mathematical examination papers and became a second wrangler. Now, 12 examination papers seems to me to be way over the top. I remember when I did my final was in Birmingham in 1963, we had 6 papers, and I think Oxford also had 6 papers. I mean, 6 was about a going rate. And those days, the papers were 3 hours, which is vastly different and much more tiring than doing 2 hours papers, which seems to be the norm these days. Anyway, he sat these 12 mathematical examiners and became a second wrangler. And following year, he sat the Smith's Prize examiner and came out top. And as a result of that, largely by June 1845, he was appointed a fellow of Peterhouse College and took over as editor of a Cambridge mathematical journal. Now, there's a picture of typical students in those days. Oh, sorry, I thought that was the fire alarm. I mean, Cambridge colleges, Oxford colleges were very much smaller than they are today. I mean, Cambridge has about 14,000 students as undergraduates, probably about 10,000 postgraduates. Postgraduates were virtually non-existent in those days. Whereas I should think in this time at about 1852, there were probably only a few hundred students at the most. And so these are the graduates from St. Peter College in 1852. So it's 8 years actually after Kelvin himself graduated. And then they're quite interesting. What I like, and partly why I want to show this, was these fancy pipes they all, or 2 of them were smoking. I mean, these days smoking is considered a bit of a no-no, but obviously in those days it wasn't. And the person first of all left was P.G. Tate, and he became a co-author with Thomson on a treatise of natural philosophy. The one on the third, who's also smoking a pipe, had been one of Thomson's most promising Glasgow students, and Tate and Steele became the first and second senior wranglers in 1852. But I think that's a rather nice picture of a sort of college students in the 1850s, and I suppose some of their habits haven't changed that. Now, I don't. And why? This, in fact, is a lady whom who Kelvin wanted to marry, and apparently she refused him on 3 separate occasions, and later in life she regretted she had. But I will talk about his love life a bit later. Now, as early as 1843, William Thomson's father had begun to prepare him as a potential successor to the Glasgow Professorship of Natural Philosophy. So who says that nepotism didn't reign in those days? He recognised that as a mathematician who was unskilled in experimental demonstrations, this was a bit of a serious defect in his ability to command the attention of students, where lecture demonstrations were were par for the course. So in order to rectify this, William Thomson was packed off to Paris to learn the art of experimental demonstrations from one Victor Reynaud at the Collège de France, and he was widely regarded as the expert in the era. Now, these days, oregano is remembered by physics students who, like me, were trained in the 1950s and 60s as the inventor of a gold band hygrometer. Have any of you come across a gold band hygrometer when you were students? Well, I remember I was. Anyway, a hygrometer, again, which is an instrument for measuring the amount of humidity in the air. So he spent some time with Rayno, and he benefited considerably from the tutelage that he received under Rayno. Now, and this is a bit I like, William Thomson was unanimously elected to the chair of natural philosophy at Glasgow University in September 1846 at the very young age of 22 years old, which seems to me distinctly young. It was a position that was to hold for, well, 53 years, which certainly blocked up any sort of advancements for others. He was appointed in 1846 following the death of a previous incumbent. Now, he had to establish himself with a class of more than 100 students, and as a very young professor, he had to carry out reforms in a college which had become somewhat fossilised because you had a lot of, it was full of rather narrow-minded, slightly bigoted individuals. I mean, I can understand this problem to try and effect positive change within an institution, whatever institution it is, where you have a lot of people who've been there for years and deeply entrenched. It's very difficult. Anyway, he managed to do so, and in the first years, he was able to invest in some of the best teaching equipment available. This was sort of electrical equipment, acoustic equipment, optical equipment, and so on. And these were, he could obtain from London and Paris, which were the two leading places for making instruments. Now, while at Glasgow, Thomson carried out important electrical and thermodynamic investigations. And in the process, he was able to establish the absolute or Kelvin scale of temperature. Now, these days, well, we were familiar with the Fahrenheit scale and the centigrade scale. Now, I think a Fahrenheit, the weather forecast used to be in Fahrenheit scales, and that sort of, there was a period of about 5 years when both Fahrenheit and centigrade scales were given. That was about 40 years ago. And now, of course, it's entirely centigrade. And the centigrade or Celsius scale of temperature, after the Swedish scientist Anders Celsius, is based on the freezing and the boiling points of water. So earlier researches on the temperature dependence of gases had shown that the lowest temperatures possible to reach is about minus 273 degrees centigrade. And this temperature is referred to as the absolute zero, or often nowadays as 0 degrees Kelvin. On the scale, the freezing point of water is 273 degrees Kelvin, a boiling point of water is 373 degrees Kelvin. Now, when you think about temperature, it's often sensible to think in terms of logarithms to the base 10. Now, that would be a terror for many people, but nevertheless, that's what it's doing. In logarithmic terms to the base 10, 1 degrees Kelvin is 0, 10 degrees Kelvin is 1, and 100 degrees Kelvin is 2, and room temperature is between 2 and 3 on this logarithmic scale. Likewise, a tenth of a degree, or 100 milligrees, is minus 1, a hundredth of a degree is minus 2, and a millidegree degree is minus 3. Now, by extension, 0 degrees Kelvin is minus infinity, and that's an appropriate place for something which is impossible to achieve according to the third law of thermodynamics. Now, certainly in geographical terms for me, minus infinity is somewhat to the west of the town of Potchefstroom in the Transvaal region of South Africa. Many of you might not appreciate the humour of that remark. About 20 years ago, I heard the Today programme, which said, and I was very interested in this, that the lowest temperature in the universe and the highest temperature in the universe both occur in Oxfordshire, about 10, 20 miles apart. So I kid you not. Apparently, well, the Clarendon Laboratory at Oxford, which a few of you might be familiar, has long been an important centre for low temperature physics. And in the late 1950s and early 60s, they developed a technique called adiabatic nuclear demagnetization, which produces a temperature about 10 to minus 8 Kelvin, or minus 8 on the logarithmic scale. Now, highest temperature in the universe is about 20 million degrees Kelvin, and that's between +7 and +8. And that occurs at the Fusion Research Laboratory at Culham, about 20 miles from Oxford. Now, fusion's long been the great white hope as a limited and very cheap source of energy. It requires the use of plasmas, which are ionized atoms and widely regarded as the fourth state of matter. And the generation of energy using fusion has been one of these things which has always been 30 years into the future. So 60 years ago, it was 30 years away. 30 years ago, it's about now. And nowadays, there is a possibility that it might actually take place, not necessarily within my lifetime, but within the next 30 years. There's a place in France called ITER, or ITER, I expect, and that is a great hope for fusion. Now, because we got out of the EU, we're no longer part of ITER, and there was talk that there would be a plasma facility somewhere, I think, in Suffolk, but I don't think that's ever come to part. Anyway, during the first half of the 1960s, many years ago, 60 years ago, I was a research student in the physics department of the University of Manchester, and that has also celebrated its 200th anniversary this year. And while I was there, I worked on a pioneering device called the helium dilution refrigerator, which it was hoped could produce temperatures well below 0.1 of a degree Kelvin, or 100 millikelvin. Now, this is certainly not the time or place to describe the physics behind the dilution refrigerator, but suffice to say that we succeeded in making or in reaching a temperature of about 65 millikelvin, subsequent developments were able to get this down to 10 millikelvin, sort of 10 to the minus 2 of a degree Kelvin. And I was fortunate in a way to be a co-author with two other people on a seminal publication on the dilution refrigerator. And there are now several hundreds of dilution refrigerators throughout the world. Each year, I make a pilgrimage to Manchester. It's a bit of a weird place to make a pilgrimage to, but I go into what used to be our lab, and there's absolutely no sign of it. And it's now some rather nice, ornate, carpeted room where they hold sort of various functions, and generally there's someone there whom I tell was 60 years ago there was this enormous piece of equipment which produced the lowest temperature that was possible to achieve at the time, and they normally say, oh really, how interesting. Anyway, I feel I'm probably the last person who make these pilgrimage. But the point of a dilution refrigerator is it opens up a new temperature region for scientific investigation. And this is a very important point. To my mind, the raison d'etre for a place like CERN, which Philistines criticise for how much it costs, is that you're reaching an extreme of energy which cannot be reached elsewhere, and you never know what science will be achieved. And so you've got to go to either extreme temperatures or extremely low temperatures or extreme energies of particles or extreme vacua, and it will often open up science which you hadn't even thought about would exist. Now, I spent most of the 1980s working at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa, and this celebrated its centenary in 2022. Now, the physics department of the University of Witwatersrand purchased a dilution refrigerator from the Oxford Instrument Company in England, which then and now is still a leading company for making cryogenics and also dilution refrigerators. And as a result, I wrote an article for the South African Journal of Science, which was very much an in-house journal of Wits University, on the lowest temperature in Africa. Now, I would like to say Lord Kelvin's title derives from the River Kelvin, which is a rather small tributary of the River Clyde, which flows around the University of Glasgow. And perhaps it's rather ironic that the unit of temperature is named after this fairly insignificant river in Scotland. Now, until the second half of the 18th century, around 1780, there was very little technology to help progress the human race. A notable exception for things like windmills and water mills, particularly windmills, had quite a lot of technology associated with them, and there were quite a few designs for different types of windmills. But an awful lot of work was achieved by human and animal muscle, widely known as the beasts of burden. It's known that a building of pyramids in Egypt required a huge amount of human muscle, human labour, and in fact this can be remarkably effective. They work in coordination. Likewise, here in the West Country, has been known for many years that the blue stones in Stonehenge, which form an important part of Stonehenge, came from the Preseli Mountains in mid-Wales. For years, it was believed that these stones were transported by ships close to, and then brought fairly close to Stonehenge. But in fact, some recent research suggests that they actually would probably drag the 140 miles from Preseli Mountains to Stonehenge by human beings. Now, the use of human and animal muscle all changed around 1780 when Matthew Bolton and James Watt originally came from Clyde, they worked in the Soho Works in Birmingham, developed a steam engine, and this completely transformed society. Initially, steam engines were used for pumping water out of mines, enabling the removal of coal from previously inaccessible areas. Later, it was used for powering all sorts of machinery for a large variety of manufacturing processes. And in so doing, they created the Industrial Revolution. And really, the Industrial Revolution, which began largely in the Midlands of this country, has totally transformed world society. Some of you might remember many years ago, if you were fortunate enough to get a £50 banknote, it used to contain pictures of both Bolton and Watt. And this is the only banknote which has ever had two people on its obverse side. James Watt originally came from Greenock on the Clyde River. And early in the 19th century, steam trains began to operate which again completely transformed the movement of people and goods. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain had a huge railway network. I mean, it was really vast. Sort of places, I mean, Bath had two stations going to Bath, but places you wouldn't even imagine would have a train did. And so it was quite remarkable. And so during the 19th century, there was a vast development in the use of steam power, and Britain was a world leader in this development. Now, one problem about being a world leader is that you're slow to change to newer and better technology. And as a result, Britain was probably rather slow to realise that towards the end of the 19th century, the growing importance of electrical technology, where Germany, France and the United States of America led in this. So the moral to that story is that the good is the enemy of the best. Now, Kelvin spent a lot of time studying the relationship between work and energy. However, in this area, it's probably upstaged by James Joule. Now, I hope somewhere along here we're going to get a picture of James Joule. Here's James Joule. James Prescott Joule. There he was, a fine beard. He was a Manchester brewer by profession and a member of the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society. Now, Joule carried out a series of meticulous experiments to obtain a precise determination of how much work is required to generate a given amount of heat. And nowadays, this is referred to as a mechanical equivalent of heat. Now, I learnt it as 4.2 joules per calorie. I'm sure other units are available, but I don't know what they are. Now, one of the great landmark BBC television series to take part in the early 1970s was Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man. Now, judging by the appearance of the audience, I expect quite a few of you saw the programmes on The Ascent of Man. The resulting book had 13 chapters, and chapter 8 was called The Drive for Power. Now, at the end of the chapter, Bronowski mentions James Joule and his work on the mechanical equivalent of heat. Now, he quotes in this book, in the summer of 1847, the young William, in the summer of 1847, the young William Thomson, later to be the great Lord Kelvin, the panjandrum of British science. I did look that up in a dictionary. Apparently it's a sort of doyen and sort of a figurehead. And he was walking. Now, where does a British gentleman walk in the Alps? From Chamonix to Mont Blanc. And there he met, whom does a British gentleman meet in the Alps? A British eccentric. James Joule, carrying an enormous thermometer and accompanied a little distance by his wife in a carriage. All his life, Joule had wanted to demonstrate that water, when it falls through 778 feet, rises 1 degree Fahrenheit in temperature. He was now on his honeymoon, so there's many ways of spending a honeymoon. He could decently visit Chamonix and let nature do the experiment for him. The water here is ideal. It's not all of 778 feet, but you could get about a half a degree rise in temperature. And Bronowski says, as a footnote, I should add, they didn't actually succeed in this, as the waterfall is too broken by spray for experiment to work. Now, I've tried to emphasise the importance of steam power in the century between the latter part of the 18th and 19th century, a period of about 100 years, and Britain was prominent in this field, and this helped to create the British Empire. Virtually all the improvements to steam power were as a result of trial and error. There was, however, quite a lot of theoretical work associated with heat engines. The lead in this trend is field was the French scientist Sadi Carnot. But a prominent member of this was also this rather flamboyant-looking individual, William Rankine, who held the chair of engineering at Glasgow University from 1855 until a somewhat premature death in 1872. So he would have been a contemporary of William Thomson, and they must have interacted. I would say he was quite flamboyant, and he wrote, in addition to his science, books on articles on sonnets and ballads. So it's quite wide-ranging. And he held the chair of engineering at Glasgow from 1855 until his death in 1872. And this, as I say, in this position he would have interacted quite extensively with William Thomson, as well as Clydeside industrialists, probably like shipbuilders and marine engineers. This was a rapid technological developments in ocean navigation. And as you can see in this print, was a flamboyant who played an active role in the Glasgow Philosophical Society, which helped develop his interactions with many of the leading Glaswegians of the day. So in concluding this section of heat and thermodynamics, I want very briefly to mention the Joule-Thomson or Joule-Kelvin effect. This is a technique for liquefying gases, particularly oxygen and nitrogen, the two chief constituents of the air. If one has a gas at high pressure, which is below a certain critical temperature, and one critical phenomena form an important branch of physics, which I could give or not I, somebody else could give a whole lecture on, but it had to be below this critical temperature. And you then allow gas to expand through a nozzle, it will cool. Repeating the process and allowing a cool gas to help cool down the incoming gas, liquid finally arrives out of a nozzle. So, the period between 1870 to more or less to when Kelvin died in 1907, this marked the height of the British Empire, which, for better or for worse, Britain dominated huge swathes of the world, characterised by a phrase that the sun never sets on the empire. Now, Glasgow was the second city of empire after London, and the shipbuilders on the River Clyde produced a large percentage of the world tonnage of shipping. And shipping in those days were dominant for travel, for moving goods, and also very particular for moving troops. I mean, the Boer War, which took place between 1899 and 1902, which again, having lived in South Africa, I was very interested in. That was only really possible because you had ships which could go from somewhere in England down to the Cape, a distance of about 6,000 miles. I mean, trying to feed an army and supply them with goods 6,000 miles away is pretty difficult. And so despite the fact of the wealth throughout the empire, but those employed in shipbuilding and other industries, they lived in appalling conditions. I mean, the slum tenements of Glasgow been among the worst in Britain and mainland Europe, and vastly lower than they are experienced today. Thus, throughout Kelvin's life, there was huge discrepancy between the wealth of a few and the poverty of the masses. Now, my own grandfather was born in 1872 and was my source of Victorian history. And apparently, he was a member for Gay Hussars and paraded a gun carriage in front of Queen Victoria to mark the Diamond Jubilee in 1897. So between 1850 and probably about 1960, Glasgow built many iron-based ships, not only for passenger transport, but also for the British Navy and other navies throughout the world. An example of this was the Japanese Navy, and the Japanese Navy completely annihilated the Chinese and the Sino-Japanese War in about 1905. Now, ironclad vessels replaced earlier wooden vessels like the Mary Rose and Nelson's flagship Victory, both of which can be seen at Portsmouth, and the T-clipper, the Cutty Sark, which can be seen in Greenwich in London. Now, Kelvin made important improvements to sounding at sea, i.e. to find out the depth of water at any position. Now, in foggy weather, which was a frequent occurrence in Glasgow, a ship's position could often be determined with accurate soundings and comparing them with a local chart of a sea. In addition to making improvements to sounding at sea, Kelvin made important advances in the design of accurate compasses, and that's no mean feat in an ironclad vessel. The first page, which advertises my lecture, shows Kelvin with one of his compasses, and he did. I mean, coming from a place like Glasgow, you were heavily involved in trying to improve the navigation of the area. Now, largely through money that he acquired through patents of his various inventions, William Thomson became a very wealthy man. And one feature of a serious wealthy is to acquire your own yacht. And this is what he did. Oh, well, that's a picture of him as an older man. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think he's about 64 then. He still seems in pretty good nick. Oh, now we've seen it got. Oh, here's this is his yacht, and you have to be seriously wealthy to have something like that. Some of you might remember Robert Maxwell, who died in about 1990. He's supposed to have fallen off his yacht and drowned in the sea. I mean, we believe he probably committed suicide. And then this year, Mike Lynch, who was the founder of the Automata Company, who took a degree in natural sciences at Cambridge and came to a tragic end in a yacht earlier this year. So yachts are not without problems. In 1870, Kelvin purchased a wooden yacht. This is the Lalla Rook. It weighed apparently 126 tons and required a professional master and crew. For many years, and this is what I rather like, his ship served as his summer residence and was also a floating laboratory for his research. It was also a place in which he was able to entertain some of his wide circles of friends. Trips were frequently made up with Clive as far as the Isle of Arran. They often travelled to the south coast of England, and this was a jumping off place for places like Gibraltar and Lisbon and Madeira. So he had a lot from his yacht. Now, on a different theme, ever since the beginning of mankind, there's been speculation as to the age of the earth and the dawn of civilization. For example, James Ussher, the Anglican primate of all Ireland, published in 1650 that the moment of creation was 404 BC, apparently at noon on October the 23rd, which seems remarkably precise. And today it's very easy to scoff at him. However, Archbishop James Ussher based his results on the best biblical and Islamic scholar data available to him. Now, Lord Kelvin worked out the age of the Earth by calculating its heat loss radiating into space. He came up with the answer between 20 and 400 million years. And this worried Kelvin because by that time the fossil record had been quite well established, and this suggested a much older date. So, being a rather sensible person, he put in his papers a proviso that his result was correct, provided no extra source of heat within the Earth was discovered. Now, one of the most important scientists is, that I think we can do without. Oh, well, that's a bit unfortunate. Somewhere there's a picture of Lord Rutherford. We did have a picture of Lord Rutherford. Any idea what's happened to him? Well, I think, well, it was a rather nice picture of him, but one of the most important scientists in the first half of the 20th century was Ernest Rutherford. He was born and grew up in New Zealand, the son of poor immigrants of Scottish descent. Rutherford showed early academic brilliance, and in 1895 came to England to study for a doctorate under J.J. Thomson. Now, J.J. Thomson is famous as the discoverer of the electron, for which he obtained the Nobel Prize in 1906. During his time at Cambridge and later at McGill University, he went to Canada. McGill, the man McGill, had actually come out, went to Montreal from Glasgow University and set up this university, which he named after himself. And Rutherford at McGill was involved in the study of radioactivity. And in the process, he showed that a radioactive material emitted alpha particles, which were slow-moving ions of helium, as well as beta particles, which formed fast-moving electrons. And in 1908, he received a Nobel Prize for chemistry. For some reason, he always despised chemists, but he never obtained a Nobel Prize for physics, which was a bit odd. So he came to Manchester University in 1909, and in the period that was there, 1909 to 1919, Manchester was probably the leading place in the world for physics. Now, in 1904, while he was still at McGill, he came to England to give a lecture at the Royal Institution in London. Now, some of you might know the Royal Institution in London, the most prestigious place, made famous by the researchers of Michael Faraday, whose statue, very large statue, stands on the foyer. Now, there's a world-famous lecture theatre there. Anybody who's anybody has lectured at in this lecture theatre in the Royal Institution. And so he came into this lecture theatre, and he gives an interesting account of his lecture. I came into the room, which was half dark, and presently spotted Lord Kelvin in the audience, and realised that I was in for trouble, as the last part of my speech, dealing with the age of the Earth, where my views conflicted with his. To my relief, Kelvin fell fast asleep. That's part of the story I can understand. But as I came to the important point, I saw the old bird sit up, open an eye, and cock a baleful glance at me. Then a sudden inspiration came, and I said that Lord Kelvin had limited the age of the Earth, provided no new source was discovered. That prophetic utterance referred to what we are considering tonight, radium. Behold, the old boy beamed upon me. So Rutherford moved from Manchester to become professor of physics at a Kelvin laboratory, and he got around him an outstanding group of students. Now, he died rather prematurely as a result of a strangulated hernia in 1937, but many of his research students held chairs in the physics departments of leading universities in England during the 1950s and 60s. Now, I was an undergraduate, as I said, in the physics department at the University of Birmingham between 60 and 63. And the two professors, Philip Moon and Bill Bertram, had both been students of Rutherford. I believe Bill Bertram, who lived well into his 90s, was the last of his students. Now, one requirement of an ever-expanding British Empire was the necessity to be able to communicate rapidly with all parts of it. For example, in 1805, it took over a week for news of the victory of Trafalgar and Nelson's death to reach England. Likewise, anything going to, say, India would require best bit of 6 months to get a message there and back. So nowadays we take it for granted that we can telephone to almost any part of the world. And I remember in 1979, when I was making my first visit to the United States of America, my sense of awe, phoning from Philadelphia to Bath, and hearing the person in Bath as clearly as if she'd been next door. Now, Thomson was heavily involved in the attempt of laying the first transatlantic cable. Now, somewhere along here, well, I'll have to go back. This is a ship in which they attempted to lay the cable. This was the Great Eastern, and it had lain in dock for a long time, but it's the only ship which was large enough to carry 6,000 tons of cable, and it's Great Eisenberg Kingdom Brunel ship. It was some 20,000 tons and was the largest ship in existence. Now, it wasn't without its problems, because the telegraph cable broke on various occasions and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. So they had to start it again. And it was very much a British project, and that was mainly because of their involvement in the American Civil War. That America was involved in the Civil War. 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th and one of the most distinguished of American presidents, was assassinated while attending the theatre. Now we have both the 45th and the 47th President of the United States currently in that position. And Kelvin was heavily involved in this laying of a cable, and he was on board this ship, and it was successfully laid, and they managed to pick up a cable which had broken, and were able to complete that too. Okay, now, in recognition of this work, Queen Victoria knighted William Thomson at Windsor Castle in November of 1866. Now, discussing a scientist like Lord Kelvin, one naturally concentrates on his scientific and engineering contribution. However, like all of us, he was made up of flesh and blood, hormones and emotions. Now, the path of true love often does not run smoothly, as I, as millions of others, can testify to. And on 3 separate occasions now, we have to go back a long, long way. Oh yeah, on 3 separate occasions, he proposed to this lady, and she was apparently a renowned beauty, which I can't say I quite agree with, but anyway. Each time she refused him. And then later in life, she regretted that she had never married him. So I can possibly comment on something like that. In September, William Thomson married someone called Margaret Cram, who was a daughter of a prosperous cotton manufacturer who was in fact his second cousin. And then she suffered from ill health for most of his life, and she remained an invalid until her death in 1870. Now, while visiting Madeira on his yacht, he became acquainted with a Blandy family who lived in the island. A year later, he returned to Madeira on board his yacht, the Lalla Rook, and proposed to Anna Blandy, who became his second wife in June of 1874. So Kelvin was 50 at the time, and she outlived him, dying in 1916. And there were no children from either marriage, which in ways I think is a pity, because I'm sure that Kelvin offspring would have been pretty bright. Now in politics, this will go down well with Barthonians. In politics, William Thomson was a lifelong Liberal, and through his friendship with several liberal aristocrats, it was not surprising that he was elevated to a peerage in 1882, the first scientist to be thus honoured. With natural connections to Kelvin Grove and with the University of Glasgow, location of the University of Glasgow itself, he became known as Baron Kelvin of Largs. Now, during his lifetime, Lord Kelvin received some 21 honorary doctorates from universities around the world, and these included pretty prestigious places like Princeton, Yale, Toronto, and Heidelberg. He was a member or honorary member of nearly 90 learned societies, of which the BRLSI was not one of them. An academy. He was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 1851 and was awarded its prestigious Copley Medal in 1883. He was President of the Royal Society from 1890 until 1895, and he was appointed to the Order of Merit in 1902. I mean, the Order of Merit is a seriously prestigious thing. I think there's only about a dozen at one time. So Lord Kelvin retired from his chair at the University of Glasgow in 1899 after 53 years in the position, and he became the Chancellor of the University in 1904. He continued working right up to his death from a severe chill on the 17th of December 1907. His funeral took place in Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of December, and he's buried close to Isaac Newton. A very great name in British science had passed into history. Well, that essentially, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my talk. If I can, I want to try and find, there was a nice cartoon of Kelvin. It's seen appear somewhere. It's somewhere there, but it seems to have disappeared in the black hole. Anyway, that is my presentation of Lord Kelvin. Thank you.
Peter, are you happy to
Yes,
your
yes,
own
I will.
questions?
I'll answer what questions well, you can ask the question, whether I behave and answer is another matter, but...
I'm not sure whether we're a hybrid event tonight or not. I think we are, but we don't have another microphone. So we do.
We do.
Excellent.
Well done.
So what I'll do is I'll rush around and present you with the microphone so you can ask your question. And the point really is that the people online will be able to hear them.
Yeah, do we know who's online?
We don't know how many.
Oh.
I don't.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great talk. What do you think his most important contribution was?
Well, he made numerous ones. I would have thought that, in a way, establishing the Kelvin scale of temperature is important. And on a practical level, I suppose, laying up the first transatlantic cable. I mean, he was a rare example of an outstanding scientist in sort of physics terms, and also an outstanding engineer and technologist. I mean, this is a pretty rare combination.
Peter, that was...
What do I do? You don't need to do anything.
You don't need to do anything. That's what they say. No?
The
Can
point
I-
is that it's
Oh, can I be heard?
It's not amplifying
Peter, that was fascinating, and I have two questions. One is, I don't know if I missed out on this, but when Kelvin was working on the age of the Earth,
Yeah.
what did he conclude? What was the age of the Earth?
Well, I think he worked out that it was, I think, about 40 million years old. But
40 million.
Well, somewhere between 40 and 400 million. I mean, it was a pretty difficult calculation, so you got wide margins of error. But the important point was that the fossil record, which in those days, some of you might remember the name of Gideon Mantell, who discovered the iguanodon in the Sussex countryside around 1825. I mean, the fossil record has suggested that there were creatures which were vastly older than that. So his ideas, I mean, his calculations were correct within the framework of his assumptions. The trouble was his assumptions were wrong.
Right, so he was working within the parameters that were available at the time.
Well, he's working, it was a correct calculation, but he made certain assumptions which weren't in fact tenable.
Thank you. The other question that I wanted to ask you was, when you were talking about Oxford being the place where they achieved the highest temperatures in the universe and the lowest.
No, this is Culham.
Sorry?
This is a Culham laboratory, which is about 20 miles from Oxford.
Right, okay. Well, my curiosity is as to how this was achieved and how did this affect the environment to achieve that level of temperature on Earth?
It's in an enclosed, something called a tokamak, where you put in sufficient energy that the gas is ionized, so it's got a charge, and you have a whole series of magnets where you keep the plasma within the circular tokamak, so it never goes out. And of course, if it touches a side, the whole thing just collapses, I mean, to a low temperature.
So was this a safe thing to do?
As safe as houses. I kid you not.
Thank you very much.
But also, I mean, energy from fusion power has been a sort of holy grail for many, many decades, and it looks now that perhaps within the next 20 or 30 years, we might actually achieve it. So those of you who are under 20, and I'm delighted to see a few of you, may well sit in your lifetime. I doubt where I'll sit in my lifetime. But you never know, I might live to be 130. Right, Francis.
Peter, I always learn something new listening to you. Thanks very much. In the history of X-rays and radiology, one of the stories is how Röntgen sent two of his papers, only two, to England. One went to Schuster and the other one went to Kelvin. Schuster got on with it and did lots of X-ray work, and Kelvin said, I don't think this is going to work. Now, is there any way of excusing that? Because he seems to be...
Well, he's probably a busy bloke. Schuster actually was the first professor of physics at Manchester University, and the physics building is named after Schuster. In fact, at the moment, it's undergoing a huge renovation, so the place where he worked is now looking like a building site. I mean, I can't explain it. I mean, Schuster was of Germanic origin, so he might have felt this was a fellow German, so he might have that. But also Kelvin might feel, well, you know, Kelvin was a busy guy for most of his life, and he must just say, well, I can't be bothered by this German sending me this information. You know, he had more things to do.
Is it possible that it's explained by the relative ages of the two people we're discussing?
Well, yes.
The history of science is littered with theories that were
Yes,
rejected
yes.
by old people.
Yeah, I mean, towards the end of his life, he did come in for criticism about not accepting modern advances. I mean, he died in 1907, and that was the beginning of modern physics. I mean, things like Planck's law and Einstein's ideas of special relativity and the photoelectric effect. And I wouldn't be surprised if Kelvin dismissed all this as sort of the sort of bleatings of a younger generation, whereas in fact it was fundamental for new physics. I mean, he existed in the height of the classical era, I think it would be true to say. And although perhaps modern physics had just started, he was probably too old to sort of appreciate it.
Another question?
Thanks very much. I guess a comment, not a question. In addition to all the things that you've described, Kelvin was also, as you know, a pioneer in fluid dynamics related to some of the topics you've talked about. And there's a whole range of things in that topic named after him.
Yes.
The wake behind a duck is the Kelvin, called
Yes,
the
the
Kelvin
Kelvin,
wake.
yes.
The
Kelvin angle.
Kelvin,
If you
exactly.
watch ducks or rowers going, you can see there's a sort of stream going up 50 degrees, is it 51 degrees, something? And that is a
famous
Kelvin.
angle.
That is a Kelvin angle.
And there's Kelvin instabilities and Kelvin
Yeah,
circulation.
I mean, this is.
Slew of stuff. He would be a major figure in science if it was only his contributions in fluid dynamics. And you described a whole range of other things.
And
However,
he
I
also
think
did important work on definitions of units of electricity and things like that. But it's all, well, in a sense, a little bit tedious for an hour's lecture.
he was quite, I think he was dubious about the possibility of flight, though. I mean, manned flight. And I think that was one of the things he said wouldn't work. So ironic for a fluid dynamicist to not be keen on.
Yes, well, of course, he died in 1907, which was 2 years before Blériot flew across the English Channel. And I mean, the Wright brothers, he was alive when the Wright brothers did their flight in Dayton, Ohio in 1903, but it wouldn't be surprised if you never heard of it. And it was only a flight of about 100 yards. I mean, it's apparently that flight is less than the wingspan of a modern jumbo jet. It shows how short it was.
With reference to the Kelvin angle, I might remind everyone that Kelvin was a rower.
Yes.
And when you're sitting in your boat, you face backwards.
Yes.
So you have plenty of opportunity to see the Kelvin.
Yes, you
Now
do.
we've got an online question here, which we probably should have guessed would come, because it comes from Don Cameron, who is proud to be a graduate of Glasgow University, I think. And Dom says, I remember seeing the experiment in which a block of pitch was set on a little wooden staircase. Over decades, it flowed down the stairs like a very viscous liquid. I first saw it in 1960, and visiting it recently, it had flowed further. What do we think about that, Peter?
Well, I mean, that was one of his experiments. I mean, he's doing experiments which will go in for posterity. So he did have this pitch, and that's a sort of a viscous liquid. And I think there was great excitement a few years ago when a drop, which had been dropping for about the last 50 years, actually did drop. And in fact, it got a mention on the Today programme, I think. So there's that. And also, he did have a tube which I think was half filled of copper sulfate and half filled of a transparent liquid. Copper sulfate's blue, and half filled with something like toluene. And these are not mixable, immiscible. And over 150 years that it's been there. There's a tiny bit of mixing at the interface, but really not very much. So he did devise experiments which were going to go on for an extra 300 or 400 years. Quite
I
far-sighted.
hope there was someone there with a camera to catch the drop pitch when it dropped.
Yeah, I mean, to get it as an item on today's
I
programme.
guess it probably would have announced itself coming quite a bit beforehand.
Oh, for weeks, months, years. You know, any moment now.
Are there any more questions? Perhaps I could call upon members of the audience to think whether they know of any other professors of physics who owned a yacht. I'm not aware of any.
No, you've got to be seriously wealthy to have a yacht. And he made a lot of money through his patents. So he obviously had a good sense for business as well.
I did know somebody when I was at the University of Washington in Seattle, not a physicist, but a biologist who had a seaplane, but it's not quite in the same.
Oh no, nothing like, no, very well
same
done.
league as a yacht.
No.
You know what happened to the tidal prediction machine? The event with by 25 turns of the handle. So for the ships going in and out of Liverpool, 900 each month, roughly. You know where that is now?
No.
It's in the Science Museum. Oh, is it really? Yeah. Okay. There's several of them there. And they were still using Kelvin's ideas to predict times for D-Day. So that's called the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability, I think that gentleman was referring to. When you see the wind on the water, so I use something from Scotland called McNamara, it means wind on the water. So when you're walking past the road, you see the ripples. That's known as the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability.
The tidal machine is arguably one of the first ever proper computers, and he built it literally out of cogwheels, and you literally turned a handle to make the calculations, and the design was so good that it was still in use as a design until the 1960s, before it was replaced by digital computers.
I think he relied on some astronomical data as well, due to the sun and the moon, the influence on the tides as well. It's all their own machine. Well, the equations, yeah.
It's quite a thought thinking about computation done by machines where you turn a handle. The Hodgkin-Huxley equations, which describe the course of action potentials in nerves, were calculated in exactly that way in 1952 on a machine which some of us in this room will be old enough to remember, called a Fackett machine.
Yeah, I think I vaguely remember that.
Did you have a Fackett machine ever?
Well, I don't think we called it by that name, but I mean, but I think we did, yes. Yeah. When I was at Birmingham, you used to have to go like this, and yeah.
I think we're probably running into the sand, or possibly the pitch here, with the questions, but probably some of you will want to have a word with Peter afterwards. I think it's been a fantastic occasion, really, a lot of fun, and what I think I enjoyed most was Peter presenting himself as an extremist. I really enjoyed that very much. But at the same time, you also managed to present yourself as a liberal as well.
Well, yes, yeah.
So an extremist liberal talk from Peter Ford. Thank you very much. And we'll look forward to your next talk.
Well, I don't know who's going to die or have a centenary, or won't be around for the 300th anniversary, perhaps. In 100 years' time, you'll get someone around to give a 300th anniversary of the birth of Kelvin.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Peter.